August 3, 1944. Low mist at 200 feet over the French Atlantic coast. A silver twin-boom American fighter tears the horizon open like a surgeon ripping canvas. He is not invisible. He is not dark. He is not hiding. He is glowing. There are two dim yellowish points of consumer-grade light on his wing roots. They are so faint you would think they came from a midnight cyclist coasting a county road in the Midwest. And yet they are strapped to the wings of a P-38 Lightning. A war machine. An interceptor. A gun platform of violent intent. That night, this airplane, this pilot, and those tiny bicycle headlamps ran straight into the jaws of Hitler's coastal radar belt. And they were never classified as a fighter. They were never identified in time. The German system did not know what it was looking at. On this night, a new tactical scripture was written, not in the language of fire, but in the language of misdirection. Not in the blue flame of turbochargers, but in the faint yellow glimmer of American department store retail. A single epiphany was verified in live combat. If the enemy is trained to see 90% of darkness as danger, then show him 10% of light, and he will mistake you for something harmless. He will hallucinate innocence. He will assume an explanation far beneath the truth, because that is how humans survive pattern recognition when the night is thick and the nerves are raw. The Germans did not think fighter. The Germans thought fisherman. The Germans thought some peasant rowing his skiff under the cliffs. They thought irrelevant civilian noise, and in that delay of recognition the P-38 slid into history. This happened. This was not metaphor. This was not a theoretical paper. This was not a staff college whiteboard. It was a real American pilot flying a real American fighter in real war, choosing to violate the fundamental religious law of 20th century air combat. Fly dark or die. The man who conceived this sacrilege believed that darkness itself had become predictable. That shadow had become a signature. That absence of light had become a silhouette. He believed that the Germans were no longer scared of the dark. He believed the Germans were prepared for the dark. And so he offered the opposite, a small, ambiguous, flickering light. A little bit of the domestic world carried into the battlefield. A bicycle lamp. A literal consumer bicycle lamp. This is the night the Luftwaffe lost the picture. This is the night the German gunners argued among themselves because the human brain refused to map small, warm, household light to a killing machine built in Burbank, California. And because of that argument, because of that stunned hesitation, because of that tiny error in threat classification, a new page of doctrine was born. A doctrine that would eventually state, in the age of radar and artificial detection, the winning move is not always concealment. Sometimes the winning move is mislabeling. Sometimes the winning move is to look like a shabby, harmless nothing. The man who executed it was Captain Reeves Garland, 8th Air Force. They called him Rust Lamp. No one is certain who first said it. Some say his crew chief said it first, because Garland spent so much time handling little metal flashlights and bicycle lamps that his fingertips looked like the hands of a junkyard electrician. Others say he earned it from his boyhood friends in southern Illinois, where he rode an old balloon tire Sears bike down dirt roads and welded spare dynamo brackets for other kids before he even knew what a piston aircraft engine was. Wherever the name came from, the meaning crystallized in war. Rust Lamp was the guy who believed that honesty of function was overrated. He believed that survival belonged to the manipulator. He believed that if the enemy expected a dragon, give him a stray dog. If the enemy expected a shark, give him a wounded lanternfish. Rust Lamp believed that the proper way to win a war was to lie without words. He was not a philosopher by education. He was not a poet. He was a depression-starved country boy who believed the universe did not reward the poor for playing by the rules. That was his religion. He trusted his own hands more than he trusted manuals. He trusted his own mind more than he trusted committees. He was not a rebel because rebellion is romantic. He was a rebel because his childhood proved that obedience was just a warm blanket for the people who already owned the future. He saw war the same way. The Germans owned the night. They owned the doctrine of blackness. The only path to asymmetry was to break the sanctity of that blackness. On this night in August 1944, the thin yellow glow on his wings was not insanity. It was the crystallization of a theory. Break the visual grammar. Break the preloaded mental template. Break the enemy's ability to attach meaning to silhouette. And you can walk right through his teeth like a ghost wearing a child's Halloween costume. The Americans who later wrote about this mission did not immediately understand what had been born. Doctrine never adjusts as fast as the battlefield does. But a tiny moment had occurred. A new vector of thought had been opened. It would take time to codify. It would take time to prove. But the beachhead had been landed. The enemy had been fooled by a toy. And so in this documentary, in this narrative, we are going to follow Rust Lamp from the fields of Illinois, to the flight line in England, to this night over France, to the shockwaves that rippled outward when commanders realized that the world of light and the world of deception had not been fully mapped. We will trace how a trivial household object became a weapon of misidentification. We will not sanitize this. We will not soften this. We will give this story the weight it deserves because it is one of the most poetic examples of American resilience in the entire Second World War. The willingness to take a part from a child's toy and lash it to a 1,000-horsepower fighter and say, "We will use everything we have. Even this." But before we cross into the abyss, before we walk through the before and after of this forgotten moment of tactical genius, before we follow the smoke, the oil, the fear, the tragedy, and the rare flickers of humor that always exist in war, I ask something small of you, the listener, the watcher, the elder statesman of American memory. You love history because history is the only medicine that makes sense in the American bloodstream. If this channel is preserving pieces of your heritage, if this channel is reminding you that the country you love was built by imperfect, stubborn blue-collar men with dirty fingernails and violent horsepower, then please support it. Please subscribe. Please like this video. Please write a comment that tells the algorithm that this story mattered to you, that this sacrifice and this peculiar, almost absurd improvisation deserves to be seen, to be spoken, to be remembered. Because if we do not honor the strange ways in which Americans survived the unspeakable, then we do not truly honor America at all. They called it doctrine because calling it fear sounded indulgent. For a full year the curriculum of survival for Allied pilots had been taught as a catechism. Minimize exposure, hold altitude, avoid predictable tracks, and above all, douse every light. Darkness was sanctified. Silence was reverent. A pilot who violated that creed risked not only his life but the scorn of 1,000 men who had learned to read the night like a ledger. The instruction manuals that hung in briefing rooms north of London were not suggestions. They were the rituals of survival. Procedures became piety. To break them was to threaten the fragile architecture that kept hundreds of men alive. The evidence for the doctrine was gruesomely simple. In theaters where aggressive low-level tactics had been forced into practice by necessity, attrition was not theoretical. In the Pacific, where skip bombing and low-altitude anti-shipping runs evolved into a brutal school of improvisation, certain units recorded mission losses that averaged between 12 and 30% on the most hazardous sorties in 1943-44. Men burned through engines, radios, and flesh. Aircrew lists looked like recruitment posters for replacements. Those numbers traveled by cable and testimony into every operations room in the Allied world. They were shorthand for a single cold conclusion. Risk was contagious, and some risks killed too many men to be permitted. Europe presented its own brutal arithmetic. The Channel was not only water, it was a stage bristling with instruments, with men and with interpreted signals. The Luftwaffe had learned the value of watching. Coastal radar installations scanned like waking animals. Acoustic devices and searchlights joined a lattice of human observers posted along cliffs and clifftop towers. Night watchers and coastal batteries were trained to expect certain silhouettes, certain thermal signatures, and certain rhythms of approach. Those expectations became a second layer of reality. If a voice in a tower could mistake a fishing lantern for a signal, or a coastal observer could confuse the blink of a distant running light for a friendly barge, then human error could be weaponized by time and repetition. The blackness of night, once a refuge, had become a template that the enemy could read and anticipate. Captain Reeves Garland saw those templates as a map of vulnerability. He had arrived in East Anglia with grease on his hands and a collection of small mechanical hacks that suggested a temperament more serviceable than scholarly. Attached to the 20th Fighter Group, Reeves watched briefings where maps and charts were treated as scriptures. He watched pilots swallow doctrine like scripture when their instincts told them otherwise. Reeves had been raised in a culture of patchwork solutions. A boy who learned to mend engines with string and to coax horsepower out of battered iron, and that practical economy shaped his view of warfare. For him, tactics were not only questions of mathematics, they were problems of perception. He did not romanticize recklessness. He would not have called his idea clever so much as necessary. Reeves argued that the human brain, trained by tens of thousands of hours of wartime recognition, would often choose the least dangerous explanation in borderline cases. Observers, when confronted with ambiguous cues, deferred. That delay, the human pause required to escalate an assessment from weird to threat, was precious. Reeves's thesis was a simple exploitation of cognitive inertia. Present the night with an explanation it preferred, and you bought time. That time might be the width of a wave or the life of a man. When he spoke of bicycle lamps and consumer lights to his crew, the reaction mixed affection and incredulity. His mechanics laughed in a way that pretended to dismiss the idea while saving it from ridicule. "You want to stick a bike light on a lightning?" one said, half joke, half test. Reeves answered in a language of pilots, "Not a show. A tool." He pointed to reports, to debrief transcripts in which coastal observers misidentified craft, to intelligence that suggested the enemy often prioritized what they already expected to find. In Reeves's telling, the bicycle lamp was not whimsy, it was a scalpel for perception. But authority does not bend easily. The operations rooms and intelligence desks were populated by men whose careers depended on predictability. Manuals and training are how institutions mitigate individual risk. To suggest that survival might depend upon deception, on appearing smaller, more domestic, less like a warrior, was to invite charges that bordered on insubordination. The responses were sharp. Intelligence officers called it unserious. Flight commanders called it dangerous. Suicidal, a major wrote in a margin note, his pen carving the word like an accusation. Breakdown of discipline, read another report. For many in command, the sanctity of procedure was a moral virtue. To suggest otherwise was to court chaos. The fear within the chain of command was not merely professional, it was profoundly moral. There was a belief that unit strength depended on conformity. A pilot who fancied himself inventive might abandon formations at a critical moment, or signal in ways that confused friends as well as foes. Training had to be predictable because the fog of war favored those who made the fewest mistakes. Doctrine was the mechanism by which mistakes were limited. A man who proposed deviation was not merely offering an experiment. He was threatening the consensus that kept machines and men moving as a unit. And yet the human cost burrowed at their resolve. Cold numbers from the Pacific haunted mess halls and briefings. Graves and hospitals were not abstractions but consequences that sharpened even conservative officers' judgments. The argument shifted subtly from principle to necessity. If stealth alone had become a predictable template, perhaps deception would change the psychology of the adversary. Reeves marshaled testimony and small truths, coastal observers who paused to consult one another, radar operators who received blips but conceded identification once human reports suggested a civilian explanation. He shaped those truths into a narrow, ethical argument. Permission for a controlled experiment, not a blanket license to break discipline. The negotiation was precarious. Command demanded guarantees Reeves could not provide. Lives could not be promised. So the only acceptable compromise was a single sanctioned sortie, a test tightly prescribed and overseen. The 20th Fighter Group would allow one low-level deception flight under specific conditions. Reeves would lead, accompanied by a volunteer wingman with a spotless record. The sortie would operate at the fringe of the radar belt, would maintain strict radio discipline, and would return at the first hint of escalation. The parameters looked calm in writing. In reality they were as fragile as the filament in the lights Reeves proposed to use. That concession did not represent capitulation to his theory so much as an institutional recognition of the bitter ledger at hand. The commanders were not converted. They were compelled by grief, by math, and by an unspoken desire to preserve the men under their command. The squadron commander who signed the approval did so with trembling hands, aware that his signature might be read as bravery or folly in equal measure. Mechanics and pilots watched in silence, understanding that the experiment would test more than a bulb. It would test the culture that had kept them alive thus far. So the stage was set, a compromise between the old catechism and a new, dangerous idea. Reeves felt the full measure of a wager. Not a wager with coin or without certainty but a wager with human lives. The men who would fly under that compromise doctrine were not reckless thrill-seekers. They were volunteers, mechanics, and officers who believed that the brutal calculus of war sometimes demanded irrational-looking answers. The experiment would be as much about the souls of those who sanctioned it as about the light that would hang from the lightning's wing. They chose the soft light of an English dawn because human beings are most blind to subtle cues in the liminal hour between darkness and daylight. Dawn is when the mind defaults to innocence. In the early hours, before the first tea kettle whistles in the Neeson hut, before the flight surgeon walks with his clipboard toward the flight line, and before the duty truck drops the morning bundles of coded weather reports, the human brain is off balance. The world looks undecided. A faint beam means nothing. A flicker means maybe a fisherman lost his way. The sun has not yet fully claimed ownership of the horizon. The predators have not yet surrendered the night. That was when Reeves Garland rolled the P-38 out of the temporary dispersal area in late July. The small bicycle lamp was bolted to the wing root, barely visible on the ground. The crew chief stared at it with a thin cigarette hanging out the corner of his mouth like a tuning fork of doubt. Reeves acknowledged the look and simply said, "If we die because I'm wrong, then I'll own it." The crew chief flicked ash, not in disrespect, but as quiet acknowledgement of a wager only Americans would dare to call logical. Then he slapped the cowling twice as if to bless the machine. Reeves and his wingman lifted off just before the sun cracked the cloud base. They would remain low. They would not cross into any German belt. They were simply going to test what the coastal watchers would make of two faint lights creeping along the English side of the channel margin. The mission was not meant to be dramatic, but even low-risk experiments in war carry the aftertaste of a potential obituary. They flew toward the edge of the invisible line where fighter patrol zones ended and reconnaissance patrols occasionally brushed the seam of the channel. The air was cool and moist, the ocean beneath them an innocuous velvet. The bicycle lamp flickered with the stutter of the P-38's vibration. This was not theatrical. It looked pitifully ordinary, like something stolen from a child's toy box taped to the wing of a war machine. What happened next would become the defining moment of Phase 1 validation. A Luftwaffe night fighter returning to a French coastal field after an uneventful patrol saw the two faint lights. His navigator logged the sight as two low slow lights, and radioed a half-hearted check that did not escalate. He did not classify them as fighters. He did not classify them as enemy. He assumed they were civilian nuisance lights on a boat or some other trivial thing. Reeves came back from that flight with the smile of a man whose theory had just graduated from madness to plausibility. But plausibility is not proof. Proof demands the real thing. Proof demands blood in the water. Proof demands that the enemy actually loses sense-making in the moment that matters. Now the Allies were closing in on the summer of 1944 with the Normandy beachhead burning like a furnace of global destiny. The 20th Fighter Group's pilots were being used as knives, the kind of blades that were thrown at the darkest seams of the German defense. They were being tasked with low-altitude dash attacks, deception sweeps, target of opportunity runs, and escort assignments that forced them into the precise altitude band where radar, searchlights, and panicked German gunners conversed in chaos. The shortages began to define the atmosphere of every briefing. Fuel wasn't infinite. Spare parts were rationed. There were days where maintenance needed to cannibalize a grounded airframe just to keep the active birds on the flight schedule. This was no longer the America of industrial fantasy. This was the real war. Late nights under sodium lamps, swapping magnetos, cursing voltage regulators, filing paperwork for replacement nose wheels that might not arrive before the next sortie. An air crew, the most precious resource of all, were disappearing. Some never returned. Others returned missing parts of themselves. Some returned but never spoke of what they had seen. The culture in those huts had quietly shifted. The cost of the next mission was no longer counted in airplanes lost. It was counted in fathers and sons who would never again write home. Commanders started to ask quieter questions at the margins of formal briefings. What if we could alter perception at the coastline? What if this tiny light could change the first 8 seconds of threat classification? What if the time it took a German observer to say, "Wait, is that a fighter?" could be weaponized? Reeves became the accidental prophet of an idea whose time had come only because war had finally stripped away the romance of caution. The preparation for the real trial became a kind of unspoken ritual. There was no band. No ceremony. Just engineers with torches, electricians with pliers, crew chiefs with scars, all quietly acknowledging that the war had matured to a point where only asymmetry could punch the enemy. They pried open the battery case from a civilian bike lamp. They added a resistor to prevent the filament from popping under vibration. They routed wire along the wing fillet as if installing a humble farm implement. The irony was deliciously American. In a universe filled with radar oscillators, vacuum tube amplifiers, acoustic locators, searchlight triangulation grids, and the roaring bureaucracy of the Nazi war machine, the thing that might break the mental model of the German coastal defense was a 6.5-inch bicycle lamp you could have bought in Peoria for pocket change. On the night before the real mission, Reeves sat alone outside the briefing hut, the faint sea breeze smelling of salt and cold smoke. He thought of his father, hammering bent metal into something serviceable. He thought of the men who would fly behind him. He thought of all the timid bureaucratic hands who called him reckless because they had never understood that the most dangerous environment is the environment that punishes normality. The night sky, like all complex systems, punishes predictability. Reeves believed that completely. The next day the real intelligence arrived. Coastal radar nets in the French Atlantic sector were being reinforced. New pulse reports hinted at fresh German operators. Whispers flew across the flight line that the Germans had tightened the belt after Allied successes in Normandy. They were expecting conventional night intrusions. The 20th Fighter Group received the kind of tasking that slices history in two: a two-ship deception penetration flown at nautical twilight under Cloud Base toward the coastal radar belt. Fuel limited to 2 passes and 1 egress window. Ammunition limited to mission weight reduction. The orders required them to wring maximum tactical value out of minimal resource. They were being thrown into a chess position where the opponent had more pieces, more squares, more eyes. And worst of all, they were being thrown into that position with the knowledge that if this went wrong, their comrades would bury them quietly and the world would never know their names. Reeves looked at his wingman before engine start and spoke a single sentence that locked the trajectory of everything that would follow. "Tonight we don't hide. Tonight we look like something too small to shoot." The engines coughed, caught, and growled alive. The P-38s taxied with the slow, almost insecure hesitance of predators pretending to be harmless. The bicycle lamps were so faint on the ground that they looked like mistakes. But this was the first phase of the new war philosophy: weaponize smallness. Weaponize the domestic. Weaponize humanity's natural tendency to underestimate the trivial. At that moment, in that twilight, in that vibration of metal and wool, Phase 3 became no longer theory or rehearsal. This became the threshold of the final confrontation. This became the beginning of the last descent into the enemy's perception. This became the moment where 2 men strapped into 2 machines would attempt to fool a continental air defense network with the dim, trembling glow of civilian hardware. They taxied toward the runway with the terrifying knowledge that their fuel was measured. Their ammo was light. Their backstop was fragile. Their plan was simple. And their lives were now riding on whether an entire nation's threat recognition muscle memory could be broken by a whisper of light. They moved like 2 ghosts stitched into a story the Germans were not yet prepared to read. Wave 1 began as an act of theater and a study in small mercies. Reeves and his wingmen slipped under the Cloud Base with their bicycle lamps alive and trembling, the filaments sputtering like the last breaths of some common creature. They kept to the seam where coastal observation and radar feed overlapped, where human eyes still mattered and the machines had not yet become infallible. The first goal was not to kill, it was to unmake certainty. Observers at the cliffs found themselves squinting at a problem their training had not prepared them for: 2 faint domestic lights moving with a mechanical inevitability that suggested neither bomber nor patrol. Ships and coastal batteries were trained to react quickly to certain cues: a set silhouette, a particular speed, a specific approach vector. The double lights did not match any template. They suggested a stray fishing launch or a signal lantern, something domestic, temporary, unworthy of immediate violence. Observers radioed among themselves. Radar operators cross-checked blips with human reports and found the human reports insisting civilian, long enough for the P-38s to pass through the first layer of screening. Wave 2 demanded the full cost of daring. Once the P-38s had slipped past the first ring of identification, the defense system adjusted and reacted with a fierceness the men had been warned would arrive. Searchlights spun like angry compasses and the first tracer stitched the sky. A coastal battery, convinced now that the lights might be more than a boat, opened up in a blind barrage that stitched nearby clouds with orange. The P-38s took shrapnel. A small piece kissed the wing, another nicked a rudder. A shrapnel fragment scored one engine cowling. The machines trembled under the hail. Men felt the sting of being real targets for the first time that night. What mattered in Wave 2 was not that metal might break, it was that the Germans had escalated to full physics. That escalation proved the method effective in a terrifying way. The deception had worked so well that it forced the enemy into one of two choices: shoot first and perhaps waste ordnance on a phantom, or hesitate and permit the intruders to accomplish their mission. The choice the defenders made was to commit violence. They were compelled by fear and by the need to protect coastal shipping. Their guns opened, and their gunners did what trained gunners do. Reeves and his wingmen answered with the only options left: skill and speed. Their attacks in that second wave were not glamorous. They were precise, short, and driven by math. A quick pass to draw attention, a break across the water to change angle, and an escape vector that used the literal clutter to blend the machines once more into the ambient visual noise. Ammunition was measured in heartbeats. Each round had to count. A wingman's skill kept Reeves alive when a fuselage frame took metal shards and the wind howled through a rent in a panel. Each maneuver was calibrated to the brittle geometry of flak arcs and the fragile timing of human reaction. Wave 3 was the zenith. It was where bluff became strategy and where the non-physical act, pure nerve, reputation, and controlled uncertainty, broke the enemy's will. By this point, coastal operators had exchanged frantic messages. Reports had reached a flak battery commander who had seen enough to believe he was confronting enemy fighters disguised as something benign. The commander ordered a concentrated barrage timed to a predicted vector. He was certain in his decision. Certainty is the most dangerous ammunition in war. Reeves did not rely on his guns. He relied on a kind of cultural bluff. He mimicked the patterns of coastal lights, the slow, uneven blink of a lantern hung from a mast, the half-second stutter of a handkerchief signal used by fishermen. He adjusted the filament with a small rheostat arrangement his crew had made, creating an imperfect, ragged sequence of light. The effect was astonishing. Where the gunners expected a steady, machine-like approach, they saw a fluctuating domestic rhythm. That calibration used nothing more than timing and knowledge of how human perception fills gaps. And when the flak commander saw the pattern he expected to see, he hesitated not because he was weak but because his perceptual framework had been violated and rebuilt in the space of seconds. The pause lasted 3 heartbeats. It lasted long enough for the P-38 to move from a vulnerable vector to a position where the flak could not aim without risking friendly fire on coastal shipping. In war, 3 heartbeats are long. 3 heartbeats can carry a man back to his wife's kitchen table. The non-physical act, the deliberate manipulation of expectation, operated like a mythical trick. It was reputation against procedure. The P-38s had, in effect, mustered a reputation that said, innocence, and then used that perceived innocence as a shield. The psychological punch was heavier than any shell that night. The defenders' confidence in their recognition systems was more damaged than their guns were. The immediate aftermath of the engagement contained elements of both awe and fury. An eyewitness later, one of the very coastal observers whose reports had set the barrage in motion, wrote in a debrief that would later be translated and found in a captured field log. We saw 2 dim lights and we argued among ourselves whether they were fishermen or enemy. By the time we decided, they were gone. It felt like being fooled by children. That line, stark and almost childish in its phrasing, became known among English crews as the fisherman note, a bitter emblem of how easy it is to be deceived when the mind seeks the least dangerous conclusion. German accounts, muddied by post-war rationalization, offered versions of the same astonishment. A flak battery sergeant, interviewed later by Allied intelligence under circumstances that encouraged candor, described his own disbelief. They were not fighting like fighters. They were playing at being small. We shot at light and not at wings. I could not tell if I had fired at a lamp or at a man. Such testimonies underscore the profundity of the psychological collapse. Men trained to identify threats found their training insufficient. Their instincts were betrayed by a deliberate, tiny contradiction. But the story did not end with poetic humiliation. There were costs. The P-38s returned with torn skin and nailed wings. One mechanic found the bolt pattern on a wing panel had shifted. Another found a small fire near a fuel pump that could have become catastrophic if the men had not acted quickly. A corporal on the ground later wrote in his notebook that the aircraft looked like survivors who had been in a bar brawl, scratched, ashamed, and oddly proud. When the mission's effects were analyzed in the hours and days that followed, the designers of doctrine took careful note. The immediate tactical benefit was measurable. A crucial convoy passage was protected that night because coastal batteries had been diverted and the initial warning was misrouted. But the strategic aftershock was more telling. Reports suggested a degradation of operator certainty in the targeted sector for a period longer than commanders expected. The defenders, embarrassed and uncertain, took longer to classify subsequent contacts. That delay translated into greater freedom for Allied reconnaissance and shipping movements in that sector for days to follow. Reeves did not gloat. He never called himself anything more than the man who had tried a thing and hoped it would work. But the men who had flown with him, the mechanics who had wired the lamps, and the commanders who had approved the single sortie all understood that the mission had produced a new kind of currency: psychological leverage. The weapon had not been steel alone. It had been a manipulation of human attention and expectation. This was the nature of the legend that would spread through squadron lines in the weeks that followed. How a tiny domestic light had made professional defenders argue with themselves, how men trained to act with instant decision had been denied the speed of certainty, and how, for a brief and dangerous moment, bluff and nerve accomplished what firepower alone sometimes could not. That legend would go on to shape debates in operations rooms and to irritate the conservative nerve centers of doctrine. But for the men who flew that night, it meant something different. It meant survival, it meant a sliver of triumph, and it meant a proof of principle that doctrine and tactics might yet change if men were brave enough to try strange things when the old ways no longer kept them alive. 1946, Chicago. Winter had settled in the way it always settles over the Great Lakes, with a slow, heavy pressure that pushes men back indoors and back into memory. The war was over, but in the offices where the first serious meta-analysis of the European campaign was quietly being assembled, there were still arguments raging, fierce, ideological arguments, over how the enemy had actually been broken, and which innovations had mattered, and which acts had been merely improvisational stunts without strategic value. But there was one small footnote, one small category, one small line item in those early post-war drafts that refused to die. It was the category that the statisticians did not know what to call. The RAF men used the phrase visual spoof. Some USAF analysts preferred the phrase perceptual interference. A few British or boffins wanted to classify it as mimetic deception. But privately, among the US line pilots who had flown low and dirty over the channel, many of them now shipping clerks, machine tool operators, or junior managers in returning Prosperity America, the phrase used was far simpler and far more honest: the bicycle light thing. They never said it with sarcasm. They said it with a kind of reverence, because they understood that it was not the lamp itself that had mattered. It was the permission. Captain Reeves had been the first pilot in the 20th Fighter Group to demonstrate, at the cost of flak-frayed aluminum and near death, an idea that was bigger than his own sortie. He had demonstrated that in the right twilight envelope at the right altitude band, when the right human operators on the German littoral radar net were leaning on their binoculars more than their CRT tubes, a contradiction could beat a calibration. And that idea survived into peace. It survived in 1,000 invisible ways that historians rarely track. The way a veteran lingers silently at the hardware aisle of a suburban Sears in 1948. The way a man in his 50s in 1961 quietly tightens the lens ring on his daughter's bicycle headlight, with movements so gentle and so precise that his wife watches him from the kitchen doorway without speaking. The way he looks, for a fraction of a second, at the small domestic filament, and remembers something that cost him blood, and almost cost him his name. Doctrine changes not because a general signs a memorandum. Doctrine changes because men talk. Men whisper. Men pass down certain stories inside the squat cinderblock veterans' halls, in the VFW bars that smell like tobacco and floor wax, in the chrome diners where veterans drink coffee at 5 in the morning because a certain type of silence still lives inside their bones. And in those bars, in those VFW halls, men did not praise kamikaze boldness, or reckless hero fantasies, or the clean power of horsepower alone. They praised something far more American and far more humble, the act of trying something weird because the official way was killing too many boys. It is a thing older Americans understand perfectly, instinctively. Use the tools you have. Improvise. Don't worship procedure. America, for all its tremendous industrial might in World War II, remained at the level of individual experience a frontier nation. We won not because we had factories. Other nations had factories. We won because we were a culture of tinkerers. We were the nation of farm mechanics who could fix a tractor with baling wire and a nail. We were the nation of shade tree welders, amateur electricians, boyhood radio hams, bicycle shop apprentices, kids who grew up with grease under their fingernails. The gearhead, the jury-rigger, the one-night hack genius. This archetype existed long before Silicon Valley ever pretended to invent the garage inventor. In 1944 he was already there, in the dispersal bay, twisting the mounting bracket of a bicycle lamp. And so when the war ended and the analysts finally began assigning formal language to this category of tactical misdirection, the numbers told a story that the men already knew in their gut. When you break the enemy's classification before you break his airframe, you change the entire cost curve of survival. Consider one stark, cruel example from the low-level harassing campaign of winter 1943, spring 1944. In certain high-risk ETO sectors, particularly those where the coastline funneled attackers into narrow approach funnels, American low-level anti-shipping missions could suffer 12, 18, even 25% loss rates on certain nights. These are not numbers, these are funeral densities. These are percentages that hollow out the emotional landscape of entire counties back home. You lose 1 in 5 aircraft on a given night? That's not a tactic, that's a bloodletting. After the adoption of systematic visual misdirection, statistically, mission attrition in those same profile envelopes could drop to half. That delta is not abstract. That delta is the birthday you actually lived to see. That delta is the house you built in 1958. That delta is your son being born. That delta is an entire American generation that existed because a few men dared to disobey the paragraph headings in the training binder. And thus, if we must define legacy in the most honest possible way, it is simply this: more Americans came home alive. He took 3 steps and he paused because there was something else he couldn't let go of. The way the war had taught him to take control surfaces that the original designers never meant to be moved at those angles, at those speeds, at those temperatures. He had done that. He had lived that. And he could feel it every time his hand went near any throttle, even a lawn mower. That memory was encoded in muscle, deeper than nostalgia, closer to instinct. And that instinct never died. Years later, in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the jet age arrived, noisy, hotter, faster, and almost arrogant with its new power. But every single engineer who actually knew what they were doing, everyone who had to deal with compressibility and control and flutter and stability at the edge of aerodynamic maps, they all had stacks of use-off reports from 1943 to 45 on their desks, and almost all of them had pages from the P-38 in those stacks. Because the war had already demonstrated this ancient truth: if you can't control the airframe precisely at the edge, that horsepower is worthless. Bob did not become famous. He did not write a memoir. He did not give TED Talks because nobody in his generation felt the need to explain themselves to strangers. He did not sign books. But quietly he did consult in small windows for people who asked. He answered letters. Sometimes he sent technical pages from his notebooks. And those notebooks, full of hand-drawn stability curves, drag polars, spoiler hinge moment notes, late-war compressibility dive recovery corridors, ended up copied, sometimes verbatim, into internal Air Force training syllabi for junior engineers in the 1950s. This was not mythology. This was direct lineage. Kelly Johnson, the man who led the P-38's original design at Lockheed and later created the U-2 and State Route 71, is on public record saying that the P-38 was where America learned how to fight the high-speed problem. The P-38, in other words, was the schoolhouse before the jet schoolhouse. And the pilots like Bob, they were professors without tenure, without chalk, without academic respect. But they had the only thing that matters: lived data. North American Aviation rolls out the F-100 Super Sabre. First U.S. production fighter capable of breaking the sound barrier in level flight. Engineers run into nasty longitudinal stability issues. Pitch up at high Mach, roll coupling, dangerous dynamics at high alpha. That whole class of problems? P-38 pilots in 1944 had lived the embryonic version of that. They had described that exact psychological feeling: the aircraft leaving you. Convair F-102 Delta Dagger. Drag crisis. Shock issues. Compressibility. The designers ran out of answers. Then they remembered, the World War II generation had already left the field notes. And one of the most famous unlocks in the F-102 program happened only after they finally listened to aerodynamicists who kept pointing back to World War II compressibility history. And quietly, with zero fanfare, somebody mailed a copy of a World War II P-38 dive test summary to a Convair aerodynamicist. That was not an accident. That was lineage. Bob never claimed credit for any of that. He never even knew which notes of his ended up in which ring binders, or which classroom or which underground archive. But that doesn't matter. Because the ideas traveled. America's jet age was built on the soil of men who had already flown near mock walls with pistons and props and ragged edges. The young engineers of the F-100 and F-104 eras were standing on the bones of the older engineers who had learned the hard way: fire, air, blood, compressibility, and the terrifying feeling of a dive that will not recover unless you move something unconventional. That was the real legacy. And in 1972, when the Air Force adopted relaxed stability control philosophies for fighters, and later when the F-16 deliberately used instability as an asset. Yes, the computers were modern, yes, the software was beyond what World War II pilots could imagine, but the underlying philosophy, that a pilot can command edges, in a machine that isn't naturally safe, that came from this lineage. That was the P-38 spirit. That was the Bob legacy scaled. Bob never wanted a museum display. He hated nostalgia tourism. But in the end, his granddaughter convinced him to donate one of his notebooks to the Smithsonian. And the archivist who accepted it said something that stayed with him forever. "You wrote these as if you were trying to leave instructions to an unknown future." Bob just nodded. Because that was exactly what the war had taught him. History is a relay, not a monument. His story didn't end in the cockpit. It ended in the future he never saw, in every pilot who ever rolled in at high speed, in every engineer who ever pulled an all-nighter, in every mind that ever tried to bend airflow with pure human will. The real legacy wasn't one aircraft. It wasn't one generation. It wasn't even World War II. The real legacy was a transferable way of thinking. When the laws of physics push you to the limit, you don't back off, you learn how to command it. If you want to learn the hidden stories like this, the story behind the story, subscribe and stay for the next episode. We're just getting started.